On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, sustainable growth could generate $26 trillion by 2030. How did going green become so profitable?
I think that 26 trillion figure is too low. I think we were cautious.
And the CEO of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, discusses the breakthroughs in vaccinations. But is their work immune from the threat of isolationism?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Keeping global warming from reaching a critical limit would require quick, far-reaching and unprecedented efforts. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a sobering report recently to illustrate the importance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Unprecedented action is needed by both the public and private sector to transform our energy, transportation, and other systems around the world.
The world is warming at a faster rate than previously thought, and more drastic measures must be taken to cool it down. The report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that the 2-degree target set by the Paris Climate Accord of 2015 does not go far enough. Instead, the world needs to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees within 12 years.
There would be 420 million people less suffering because of climate change if we would be able to limit the warming to 1.5 degree level. And we have certain areas in the world which are extremely sensitive. It's the small island states, Mediterranean region, and also sub-Saharan Africa, which are already suffering and will suffer the most.
Today, the Earth is already warmed to 1 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. Climate scientists have predicted that even half a degree of further increase would be catastrophic for the Earth. With that, the global ecosystem could be irreversibly damaged, and the likelihood of natural disasters will rise. The conclusion is drawn from a meta-analysis out of 6,000 independent studies. Climate change will have a profound negative impact on global economics. The Nobel Prize for Economy this year is awarded to William Nordhaus, mainly for his work in integrating climate change into long-term macroeconomic analysis. Virtually all nations support the notion of gradual cuts in fossil fuel use and more investment in renewable energy. China, for example, has been a pioneer in the application of new energies, promoting solar, wind, geothermal power, and electric vehicles at home and abroad. The UN scientists say the future of the Earth is now in the hands of governments, politicians, and scholars.
Earlier, I had an exclusive interview with Nicholas Stern, one of the biggest names trying to link climate change with its impact on our economy. Lord Stern, what a pleasure to see you in Beijing.
It's a wonderful way to be back here in China. I've been coming here since 1988, and especially to Tsinghua.
Especially this year, we're celebrating 40 years of reform and opening up. I guess you have already witnessed quite a number of them.
Yes, when I came in 1988, I was teaching at Renmin Dashui, and we lived in the Youyi Bingwang, the Friendship Hotel.
Right.
And we cycled everywhere. And Beijing was full of cycles, hardly any cars. Now, of course, it's very different, although it's good that the cycles are coming back.
Which is bringing us to the topic today about the environment and also climate change. Lord Stern, recently the Nobel Prize, finally, for economics, honored decades-long research economists like you have been doing, which is linking what is going on in our environment, our climate, at the same time, to what is going on with our economy. But the question is there going to be sustainable spotlight on this issue?
Let's start with the spotlight and then see whether the spotlight picks up action.
Okay.
But the spotlight is about attention. It's about whether the world as a whole will focus on the sustainability issue. Because sustainability means offering to future generations opportunities at least as good as those that we have. I think more and more people are worrying about the opportunities that their children and grandchildren will have.
You recently in the report talking about $26 trillion likely to be created for the economy sustainably developing to the year 2030. People wonder, where does those numbers come from, first of all? And secondly, what does it take to get there?
Well, let me first say I think that 26 trillion figure is too low. I think we were cautious, understandably.
All right, and where does it come from?
It comes from, as I just described, much more efficient ways of doing things. Cities that are less congested are cities that are much more efficient.
Give me an example that would tell us exactly where those numbers would be convincing or not.
Well, if you compare Barcelona with Atlanta, Barcelona in Spain with Atlanta in the United States, roughly the same population, roughly the same income per capita. But Barcelona is regarded by most people around the world as much better off than Atlanta. Why? In particular because congestion and pollution are much less. So one part of the argument comes from efficiency, one part of the argument comes from avoiding the pollution and damage. Another part of the argument comes from the dynamics of the strong investment that will come, and a fourth part of the argument comes from the technical progress that we would generate by moving rapidly down.
But
and we unpack
if I
each one
could
of
jump
those.
in here, because you talk about the arguments. This is not about arguments. This is about numbers.
Yes.
So the numbers, where does it come from?
So in each, I gave you four. Yeah. So the first thing is the pollution. What is the damage done by pollution? How do you work that out? You look at the number of people who are killed by that pollution, and you look at what we're willing to pay in traffic control, hospitals and so on to avoid that kind of damage, and you put the two together.
What about the reality now, when the world is in a deficit of so-called leadership, particularly about climate change?
There are two kinds of opposition. One is to deny the climate science. So what's the problem? Well, that kind of opposition is irrational, unscientific and reducing. And we've almost won that argument. Some people might say, yes, well, I accept the science, but actually the effects are not very big. But even that, they're called lukewarmers, but even that is declining. It's education, it's evidence, it's experience, and so on. It's still there in some places, but it's declining. Now, the other side is to pretend that the costs of action are very big and very difficult. That side of the argument is disappearing too. People see that the cost of renewable electricity in many parts of the world is actually much lower than the cost of electricity from fossil fuels. People see now the development of the electric car. It's coming. It's not just some imagined idea. Now, what about the United States explicitly? You mentioned California. It's not only California. A number of other states are moving quite strongly. So it's the states, it's the cities. Hundreds of cities, towns and cities around the United States have their own climate plans. It's the firms. Firms like Walmart and Google Alphabet.
So you're saying governments are not mattering anymore?
They're not mattering overwhelmingly anymore. They do matter, and the policies of President Trump's administration have been damaging. But much of the United States is getting on with it.
Recently we got the news, Lord Stern, that President Trump, coming from the U.S. Right before the midterm election, is trying to honoring some of the agricultural states by promoting the sales of ethanol inside the United States. Of course, this is quite a neutral news, but you see some say, economists and environmentalists are reading these stories suggesting that many of the efforts being made now these days regarding climate change or not climate change policies are all political calculation rather than real concerns and real policies regarding our future. That is the big concern.
You've got to look at the way the basic understanding is moving. That's what we were just discussing. Climate change denial is not quite over, but it's a thing of the past. That's a change. The new technologies are being seen by people now. California and parts of the United States hit by fires, partly as a result of climate change. Puerto Rico hit by hurricanes, partly as a result of climate change, with 3,000 or so people dead. This is urgent. We are developing new technologies very rapidly. China is in the forefront of that story, but not just China, in Europe and California and so on as well. We're closing that deficit by focusing directly on it. But the political deficit is something that involves communication, argument, demonstration. You have a duty. You are a communicator. I have a duty.
And we are doing exactly that.
That's what we're doing now. This is the way in which deficits are closed, through argument. But also, we're in a university now. We're sitting here in Tsinghua. And young people in China, young people in Europe, young people in the United States are increasingly putting pressure on their politicians. They're increasingly choosing different ways. You know, young people use car-sharing methods. They don't necessarily want to own a car. Young people are saying, where's my pension money going?
Exactly.
Is it going in risky 19th century industries, or is it going in the modern 21st century? So there are all kinds of ways in which political pressure builds. And I believe that that story of pressure is there and there strongly, and it is surviving the current President of the United States.
There's likely to be dramatic change in the global supply chain as a result of recent debates of globalization, trade issues. But the question is whether the issues about sustainable development is being considered at all in this dramatic change of global supply chain.
Now, China grew very rapidly, primarily on coal-based energy, electricity. China is changing very quickly, and total use of coal in China plateaued probably 3 or 4 years ago. Now, what China is sharing with the world is those lessons. If China had had in 1995 the technologies that it now has, it wouldn't have gone that route, because China, why would China build cities that are congested, cities that are polluted, when it does not have to, and it's cheaper to do it another way? And it's China that's helped discover these new technologies and these new ways of doing things. So I hope very much that as China starts to work with the rest of the world to improve the communication, the infrastructure, that lesson of how to use these new technologies and not to be trapped by the old ones is one that China will share. India now is saying that it's unlikely to complete the coal-fired power stations that it has already started and planned for, because it sees how cheap it is, and because to do things through renewables and so on. And it also sees how polluted its cities are. Now, you asked about trade. I think that the policies of the United States currently on trade are very misguided and damaging. I do not know how long they will last. I hope not very long, because I think they're very damaging policies. But let's see what happens if those are followed for a few years. Those patterns of trade will change, and the United States will suffer, but the rest of the world will get on with it, get on with the new trading patterns, and those trading patterns will come with newer technologies in different parts of the world based on the lessons, good and bad, of the last 30 or 40 years.
Lord Stern, may I ask you eventually about the models?
If you look back 10 years and ask what we got wrong on the growth story, we didn't build into the models in extraordinary progress we've seen in renewables. The Stern report was 2006. The iPhone didn't come till 2007. You know, people didn't look ahead and see what could come. I've given two examples. And the one is solar and wind and the renewables. The other is the digital management. A dozen years ago, who would have thought that the heads of the major car companies around the world would be talking about the end of the internal combustion engine? One thing we can say now is that that progress is in full swing. Actually, it may be accelerating. So we ought to start building models of the next 10, 20 years where these kinds of things can move very quickly. I think we can make progress on that, and we should.
And I love the way you said it. We can and we should. Lord Stern has had long-term cooperation with China's organizations and institutions for environmental and economic studies since the 1980s. And in the past few years, China's environmental protection has gradually integrated with economic growth in a sustainable manner. Together with Lord Stern, Chinese expert Qi Ye, a professor of School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University, also explained the environment-friendly economic model under the current global circumstances. Let's listen in my interview and discussion with both of them. I'm happy to be joined once again by Lord Stern and also Professor Qi Ye. With the global environment changing, the Chinese economy is still growing, but certainly with the structural change going on right now in this country, the economic growth is going to slow down to a certain extent before it pick up again. So what would that mean for policymakers when they are juggling with economic growth rate and employment opportunities and all of these so-called pragmatic issues vis-a-vis policies that are likely only have an effect years from now? What do you make of that?
The economic slowdown certainly have posed certain challenges socially and politically, but this is really a great chance to, from the perspective of the environmental protection and the climate change.
I know you would say that, Professor Qi.
Yeah, because, you know, with the slowdown, we don't really have to deal with rapid growth of energy demand, for example, and it serves as a perfect opportunity to substitute the coal-fired power generation, you know, with the renewables, with solar, with wind. Right? So you really need to slow down in order to catch up for the substitution. So I think that's one opportunity. More profoundly is the country now, you really think hard about the growth model, and now with this idea of ecological civilization to look not only on the environment but also on the economy, on the society, and also on the politics, and how you can actually restructure and reshape the political system, social system, and the even cultural system, economic system, with this kind of thinking. Longer term, more holistic thinking, and balanced sustainability.
As you may know, Lord Stern, that there's not at all an issue of only one model. And therefore, how relevant is China's case study to the other parts of the world, particularly developing countries, emerging economies?
China's case study is extremely relevant. I mean, take energy and take cities. China grew very rapidly, largely on coal-fired electricity, coal-fired energy more generally. And it suffered the consequences through air pollution, and it suffered the consequences of bad city planning and overuse of the car through congestion and more air pollution in the cities. So China has negative lessons, and China itself has recognized, but also China has started to see the attractions of public transport in terms of efficiency of moving around in cities. China has started to see the advantages of clean air in Beijing. As it happens today in Beijing in October, it's been an absolutely beautiful day. We've been able to see the hills from the center of Beijing.
You sound totally, Lord Stern, I have to say, like a Beijinger now.
Well, I've lived here in Beijing in 1988.
That's right.
And when I was here in 1988, very, very few cars, nearly all bicycles. Now actually the bicycles are coming back, many of them electric, of course, because it's a better way to get around. So we're starting to see not only the negative lessons of what happens when you forget about these things, but also what you can do. Other countries will learn. They are urbanizing, they need energy, and there are strong lessons from China on both.
It is not just what China is doing inside the country, but also how China, as one of those emerging economies, is working with others in partnerships on some of the new ideas and initiatives in order to make better our world. I think it sounds like a slogan, but it's not. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative, Professor Chi, there has been a lot of debate about the environmental costs some of the projects might have eventually. And this is very important, a question to be asked about the so-called environmental friendly infrastructure.
Well, just like what Lord Stern just talked about, China has so many negative lessons learned. And if there is one country that would have this precautionary thinking about the negative lessons, it is China. So when taking the projects like along the Belt and Roads, right, this initiative, and there will be a lot of infrastructure-related projects, and I think this kind of precautionary thinking is very, very important. Just ahead of the actual implementation. So I think this is very positive, and people begin to ask hard questions about the potential consequences. Right now, we're doing this. We know these lessons. We have the technologies. We have the ways and means to deal with this, and at a much lower cost.
China has become such a focus of attention as a result of its growth rate. But at the same time, whether other countries are doing well, whether they are doing sufficiently enough, whether they are trying just to blame or actually they're trying to create, that's a question to be asked as well.
Yes, it is. And let me give you some examples. Mexico and Colombia in Central and Southern America have very strong, clear plans and policies around them. Rwanda in Africa has very clear policies and plans. From here, from Beijing, I'm going to Indonesia later, and one of the reasons I'm going is to discuss with their planning ministry their 20-25-year plan for the transition to the low-carbon economy. So in different ways, in different places, I've given examples from Latin America, from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from South Asia.
Right.
These are very important examples where the thinking is changing, the discussion is beginning. Different paces, different methods in different places, but it really is moving around the world.
It sounds like, Lord Stern, many of the examples and case studies you gave just now are actually coming from developing and emerging economies.
Yes, they are, and that's very important.
Exactly, but if you look at the global supply chain, the developed economies, their roles are also extremely important. So are we seeing a divided world where one part of it is actually making tremendous effort, while the other part of it is lying back and say, well, I did some, and therefore I could relax, or I have enough politics at home, and therefore I have to take care of myself?
It makes me smile a little bit, Wei, because 10 years ago, the story was that the rich countries were making all the work, doing all the heavy lifting, and
as they see it.
And then the poor countries were doing nothing. Now, we've learned a lot in the last 10 years around the world, and we see in many cases the developing world, the emerging market countries starting to make the pace. And that is a very healthy development. It's leadership elsewhere in the world, not just from the rich countries. You have seen some rich countries falter in their leadership. United States, clearly, the transition from President Obama to President Trump saw negative movement, backward steps in the leadership in the United States. But that is, I hope, temporary. And why do I think it might be temporary? Because you see within the United States, the states and cities and firms who have recognized that the future and the future profits lie in the technologies of the 21st century, not in the technologies of the 19th century.
Thank you so much, Lord Stern, Professor Chi, for being with us. All the best.
It's a pleasure, Wendy.
Thank you.